Today we're talking about one, I think, the greatest of all novels of the Western world, The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. One difficulty of reading these Russians is everyone complains, the names. But if one pronounces the name a little bit correctly, then one can spell it correctly, I think, and then one can remember the names. So I will try to enunciate slowly and distinctly these names, and you'll get to know these people a little bit, these characters, and we'll proceed. Dostoevsky was a great psychologist, the greatest in fiction, I think. It's hard to judge these things, but Lord, he was interested in the depths of human beings, and in his opinion, and I think in most people's opinions, the Russians are great. Russia provided great samples of psychological complexity and emotional intensity, such passion, that I think that's, I don't know if it's true. Are Russians more passionate than other people? They seem to be. Dostoevsky certainly thought they were. And he studied them, and he studied himself, because he was one. During his lifetime, he seemed to be addicted to gambling at certain points of his life, an addiction that he slowly overcame, it seems, with the help of his second wife. And he was certainly subject to bouts, B-O-U-T-S, bouts of depression and soul-searching, and he was passionately, and here's really the essence, he was passionately religious, passionately a Russian Orthodox believer. I think he was. It's hard to see any other way. But certainly he was honest about doubts and honest about reasons for doubting. A great intellect, a great student of the human psyche, and in his greatest work, Brothers Karamazov, he shows all that. It was his last work. He died the year after he completed it. He died in 1881. He was born in 1821, so he lived 60 years. We better tell a little bit about what was, I think, the key event in his life. I think he thought so. As a young man in Moscow, he had attended gatherings, meetings of a certain group, I forget what, it wasn't a religious group, vaguely political, I think, I don't remember the details, but suddenly the Tsar's police had raided this meeting. Everyone was arrested for treason, presumably. This was the time, I guess it must have been the 1840s. Historically, the period between the fall of Napoleon, 1815, and 1848 is a period of political reaction is called in Europe. That is, the final defeat of Napoleon meant that traditional monarchies, absolutism, had reaffirmed its hold on the countries of Europe that had been briefly liberated by Napoleon. Liberated? Not really, but to a certain measure. So during those years, 1815 to 1848, 1848 was a year of revolution, where there were various revolutions around Europe, certainly not in Russia, but the effect of these revolutions was felt everywhere. During those years, 1815 to 1848, these were years of political repression, because all of these monarchs felt how precarious, how uncertain, unstable their power was. So secret police were everywhere, spies for the government were everywhere, and each monarch, including the Tsar of Russia, whose power was the most unlimited of all, felt very insecure. This was not a good time to attend a meeting that had anything to do with politics at all, and Dostoevsky had done this. He had already started to write, had already published some short novels, I think, which had shown his talent, but anyway, the raid occurred, he was arrested, he was tried and sentenced to death. And he was going to be shot to death, and so there it was, the end of his life. He was tied to the stake, or he stood there. The riflemen, like in that great Goya painting, the riflemen were there. Whatever they say, 1, 2, 3, fire, or whatever. 1, 2, 3. A writer comes in with a pardon for Dostoevsky, so he was that close to death, and I think he must have believed it, though this kind of thing probably had happened before. But he probably thought that his death was right there. A pardon, but the pardon meant 10 years in Siberia. Now, that was not the same as Stalinist Siberia, but still it meant work in some remote village in Siberia. But there, Dostoevsky discovered, or perhaps rediscovered, his religious passion. And he became a passionate son of the Russian Orthodox Church, a believer in Mother Russia. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church is so closely, mystically attached to a kind of mystical belief in Mother Russia. Russia must be God's country. So much suffering, so vast and overwhelming a sense of grandeur and space, and the music so wonderful, and the suffering must be God's people, must be God's land. Well, many Russians believed, and I think probably still believe, in this mystical attachment between Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church and God. So, 25 years pass, during which he produces 1 or 2 masterpieces. The main one, Crime and Punishment, which we will talk about maybe tomorrow. And then finally, he had achieved fame. He was a famous man, admired by all Russians, even Tolstoy, who was, of course, I think, jealous of him. We'll discuss that sometime too. And he wrote Brothers Karamazov. Okay. The action is centered in a town somewhere, doesn't matter where. Feodore, same name as Dostoevsky's first name, Feodore Karamazov, is a businessman, somewhat successful, and by his first wife he produces 1 son, Dimitri, and by his second wife he produces 2 more sons, Ivan we'll call him, and Alexei, whose nickname was Alyosha, which is a nickname, a diminutive, kind of cute, like Stevie, Alyosha, the youngest. But Karamazov had a servant, Grigory, who had a wife, Marfia. These names don't matter much. And Marfia was pregnant to have a child, and the child died the night of its birth. The same night, though, an idiot woman, Lizaveta, Dostoevsky loves these strange village idiot people who kind of wander around. Everybody feeds them, but men, especially drunken men, take advantage of too. The same night, Lizaveta had produced a child, born, and she died. Everyone assumed that the real father of the child was Feodore Karamazov, the father. And so Grigory and Marfia, who had lost their child that night, adopted this child, kind of, and raised this child. Now, Feodor was a very bad parent, and really, after the death of his second wife, he abandoned the children. So Grigory had basically turned the three sons over to relatives to be raised. The fourth son, they kept, as I said, adopted. His name was Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov in Russian, I think. I don't know Russian, really. I don't know Russian. But Smerdyakov is kind of a pejorative name. I don't know what it's like, but it must be a name kind of like filthy dog. Not quite that bad, but not nice. He was an epileptic. Dostoevsky was epileptic. So Dostoevsky, very interestingly, gives Mr. Karamazov, Fyodor, his own name, and gives a trait of his own, his epilepsy, to this illegitimate, lowly servant son, apparently, of Dostoevsky. Very interesting, because Dostoevsky, in the end, I think, wants to explore everything about himself, and he finds himself in all humanity, from the highest to the lowest. I think that's kind of true. And maybe he's right. I wish I remembered it, but the Romans had a saying, and probably the Koreans do too. In myself I find all humanity, or something. I don't remember. I wish I remembered that. Okay. Now, let's catch up a little bit. The action begins really when how could that be? I guess when Dimitri and Ivan have both reached their majority, meaning 21, but no. When all three have reached their majority, that is, Alyosha is now 21 too. Dimitri is more like 28. Ivan is more like 27. These don't even know each other, and it's their belief that when the last of them, Alyosha, turns 21, that they will have a right to some money from Fyodor, from that rascal, scoundrel, their father, Fyodor. So it's kind of like a family reunion. Now, what has been happening to these sons? Dimitri, the oldest, who some people say is the main character. I don't think so. The main character is Alyosha. But in the action, certainly, Dimitri is, they're equally important, all three of them. Dimitri has been a soldier, and he is a wild guy. He loves Russian soldiers, maybe all soldiers, but Russian soldiers were famous for this. He's an officer, and wild partying, wild drinking, drinking for days, and then wild. God, if they had cars, they'd have all been dead, because they would certainly drink and then hop into cars and drive at 100 miles an hour through the center of towns and things like that, and kill people too. Wild party animal. Okay. Second, Ivan, maybe the most interesting, but they're equally interesting too. Ivan is an intellectual. Ivan is an intellectual. He has been a university student, poor. To make money, he had written articles which had gained some fame. about church and state and law and things like that. And he's an intellectual. He thinks. In fact, he's the greatest intellectual in literature. Hamlet is a child compared with Ivan. Hamlet is a child anyway. Hamlet is no intellectual, frankly. Okay. Now, Dimitri is engaged to marry the wife of a colonel. Colonel. Her name is Catherine, let's say. The reason is he saved Catherine by making a very grand gesture, the officer's grand gesture, and saves Catherine from disgrace in some situation, I don't remember what, a little bit compromising to her. He saved her. Not saved her life, but saved her honor, reputation, something like that. And she, out of gratitude, is willing to, even wants to marry him. Somehow, Ivan has met her too, and he loves her. He really loves her. Now, to what degree this love is a brother's rivalry, the older brother, the older intellectual brother's scorn of the wild, uncivilized the younger brother's scorn of the older brother's wildness, or what, a complex mixture. Catherine, does she love Ivan? I don't think so. Does she love Dimitri? Certainly not. But she has this passionate Russian nature. They all do. First, if anyone who reads Brothers Karamazov for the first time, if it's your first Russian novel, you will say, "What? Do human beings anywhere really behave this way?" I guess they do. The Russians, I guess, did. And maybe if we look harder, we will see the same behavior among our own kind. But most of us are much more sedate and timid, I think, and keep a tighter rein, R-E-I-N, on our emotions. But these Russians just let their emotions just explode. They're so explosive in their angers, in their loves, in their guilts, in their confessions, in their hatreds, in their thought. So unrestrained, and that's what Dostoevsky's world is. Full of these people. You judge whether they're real. I guess they're real, but to find that many at the same time, gathered together and interacting, seems improbable. Certainly they exist. Look around. Okay. So, and the third brother, Alyosha. Alyosha has a kind of dreamy nature. He's not so passionate, actually. A much more dreamy nature. And he has wanted to become a monk in the monastery nearby. Now, he has become the student of, the follower of a very famous man who really lived. Zosima, Father Zosima, Z-O-S-S-I-M-A. The character Zosima is based on a real man, a saint in any religion. Anyone would regard him as a saint. And we even get his story, Zosima's story, which is, I think, important. And certainly Alyosha's attachment to Zosima. And really, the problem that a Zosima represents is a huge, perhaps insuperable problem to the religious skeptic, to the, I dismiss atheists as unserious people, to the agnostic. The agnostic and the skeptic, how can the agnostic and the skeptic deal with a Zosima? Okay, here's Zosima's story as I remember it anyway. As a young child, he was sick and was bedridden for a couple of years, maybe years, I don't quite remember. nevertheless, he was this creature of joy. And the smile, he just radiated joy. He was like a St. Francis, I guess, but a sickly St. Francis. And people thought he was going to die from this sickness, as I recall. I'm not sure of this. But even in the worst times of his sickness, joy. Joy at God's world. Religious joy. He recovers. And there's only one way for him to go, there's no question, becomes a monk. And he carries this joy into the monastery, and he's just one of these religious presences that really, I think, no one can dismiss. What do you do with this? To ask him, to get him involved in a religious debate about existence of God or nature of God, I think he would simply smile. He would simply, he would just radiate this religious joy. And what, is he a fool? No, he's obviously not a fool. Then it must be that he knows something that the rest of us don't know. And that's what most people believe. And I think I read recently, I read about this. I'm taking a course even in philosophy of religion, which I've taught before. And one philosopher of religion pointed out the most convincing argument for religion, because there really are no convincing arguments, is a person like Zosima. One can't dismiss him. One can either call him insane, misguided, but so profoundly misguided that even that's unbelievable, because he carries this joy, affects people by this joy, and at the same time is an intellect of great penetration and understanding. So, he is the ultimate religious argument. I think Dostoevsky thought this. I think it too. The problem, by the way, parenthetically, is what to do with this religious joy. Because this religious, the saint, what to do with a saint, especially a saint like Zosima. My own problem is such people have religious knowledge that obviously transcends creeds. And when we get to creeds, I think the creeds are so silly, so absurd, but the creeds are simply a very crude, silly human attempt to put into doctrines and stories and myths what Zosima knows. So, that's where I am anyway. Back to our story. Alyosha, what should we say? Alyosha is kind of a disciple, let's say, a young disciple of Zosima. Alyosha is kind of a Zosima. So, let's get into the action. We get this family reunion, strange family reunion, and they decide to have a meeting at Zosima's cell. Why? Because who better than Zosima to adjudicate, that is, make decisions and tell people what's fair, what should happen. And Feodore, who of course is a scoffer, scorns religion, scorns all things religious, because he's a hedonist. He leads a dissolute life of drink and grabbing pleasure whenever he can. A disgusting man, really. And loves to play the buffoon, loves to suddenly break into stupid laughter or stupid behavior, embarrass himself and everyone else. And that's what he does at the meeting. And Dimitri arrives late. They try to have a discussion, and Feodore, the father, goes into this stupid face-making, giggling, saying stupid things that have nothing to do, non sequiturs and things like that. And the meeting is a failure. But at the meeting, Zosima is watching everyone closely, and Zosima, of course, understands everyone immediately. he perceives that all of them are related to Feodor, and that all of them are sensualists. Now this is, I guess this is Russian-style thinking. It's a little hard to accept, and I always find it amazing that Dostoevsky accepted it, apparently. But then two things result from this insight that the Karamazovs are sensualists. By the way, the Karamazovs are humanity. Let's get that straight. The Karamazovs are humanity. In a sense, oh my God, they represent the various four or five, let's say 5 dimensions of every human being. Fyodor the sensualist, the scoffer, the buffoon, Ivan the intellectual, Alyosha the saint, Dimitri the wild, athletic party animal, Smerdyakov the gloomy, brooding, Ivan does that too, but spiteful, malicious, disgusting little fellow, but who has suffered also. Okay, so there they are in this cell, and Zosima does two things, as I say. First, he bows to Dimitri, Sebe, I think, just like the Koreans do, with his forehead on the floor, and he hits his forehead, I think not too hard. By the way, Zosima is he's very old, and he's very sick. He's dying. It was very kind of him to even agree to have this meeting, but he does this mainly for Alyosha. And what he means by this gesture to Dimitri is, I bow to your suffering. I see that you are suffering, and you will suffer a lot in the future. The second consequence of his insight is, he tells Alyosha, not then, but afterwards, that Alyosha should leave the monastery because he sees that Alyosha is a sensualist also. Sensualist, that is, a person who loves and needs physical pleasures, I think especially sexual ones. So Alyosha, he says, should leave the monastery. He should not live his life in the monastery, but his meaning is very kind. Kindly, as always. His meaning is that Alyosha will do more good in the world of society than he could possibly do, even for himself perhaps, in the monastery. He should go into the world, he should marry, he should have children, and so forth. Those two big consequences. Okay, time passes. Now we need to meet another character, almost major. Grushenka. What a wonderful Russian name. Grushenka, Grush, is a beautiful, exotic woman. Prostitute? No, but very free, quite free in her giving of love, but so beautiful that men are irresistibly attracted to her. And two men who are very attracted to her are, of course, Fyodor, the father, and Dimitri, the son. So father and son are rivals for the affection of Grushenka. So it turns out that Catherine, the fiancée of Dimitri, had lent, not loaned. We Americans have turned loan into a verb. And if enough people use it that way, of course it becomes a legitimate word, but it's kind of a sloppy thing to lend money. To take out a loan, noun, but to make that a verb is a barbarism in my opinion, but like many barbarisms, it is becoming acceptable. Okay, so Catherine lent Dimitri 3,000 rubles, Russian currency, Russian money. Excuse me. And in one wild evening, Dimitri had apparently spent all that money. He said to various people that he had spent all that money on Grushenka and on that wild orgy. Now, Russian style, Lord, if this can happen anywhere, this can happen in Korea too. The wild drunkard happens in the symposium kind of Plato. The drunkard who is celebrating something or other comes into the bar, money spilling out of his pockets, and buys drinks for everybody, orders a band of musicians in to perform, dances wildly, drinks wildly, everybody has a wild time. He pays for the evening. So he had said, and everyone thought, that he had wasted those 3,000 rubles on that one night with Grushenka and everyone else. And Dimitri's religious attitudes. Dimitri is, of course, somewhere between Alyosha and Ivan, and the father. He's kind of childish in his way of looking. He's like a child. He is like a child. Wild, temper tantrums, joyful, adorable, handsome, athletic, all of this. So, religiously, he's a believer. He doesn't doubt. On the other hand, to what degree does it affect his behavior? Not much. Not much. When one sees someone like him, one has to believe, one can believe, the God whom we talk about loves this guy, protects him from harm, it seems, accepts his wild orgy behavior. I don't know. Hard to say. In any case, like a child. So, religiously, he's feeling tremendously guilty about wasting that money of Catherine's, the 3,000 rubles, and he is determined to get the 3,000 from somewhere. He thinks his father owes it to him, by the way, because he thinks that when his mother died, his mother and Ivan's, they had the same mother, she left a legacy for her children. Well, this happens in Russia. I'm sure it happens in Korea too. Which Feodore could not touch, not legally. And when the boys reached 21, they had a right to that money. Probably she mother had brought that money to the marriage, but it remained hers. It was all in the contract. So Dimitri had always heard that he was to receive some money. And it's clear that if such money exists, Feodore has probably spent it. Certainly does not want to relinquish it to Dimitri, and so lots of tension, lots of anger. Of course, the boys feel some anger, some disgust, no affection, no respect for their father, who abandoned them after all, and who is a scoundrel and a disgusting man. Even physically disgusting, apparently. Okay, so tensions rise. Dimitri is angry at his father, and Dimitri needs money. Let's talk about Ivan a little bit. He's an intellectual. He is the intellectual of literature, and no one I know of compares with Ivan. He's interested in, okay, let me get this down to essentials. He talks with Alyosha. They have these long talks at a cafe. Alyosha listens, Ivan talks. But Dostoevsky never forgets that any intellectual, any thought, anything we say is bound to some context. We are saying these things for some reason. Pure reason, pure intellectual pursuit, of course, does not exist at all, not even in science. There is always the person in the concrete situation who is talking. By the way, I've gotten this far without mentioning the word existentialism. Maybe I'll talk about that in a separate lecture sometime. But I would say the ultimate work of existentialism is the brothers Karamazov. Not that Dostoevsky had ever heard of existentialism. He hadn't. But the existentialists of the 20th century kind of have some lead themes and ideas, and then look back and pick and choose antecedents. Pascal, for one, Kierkegaard, the main one, Dostoevsky too, even Tolstoy in The Death of Ivan Ilyich. These are major religious texts. Kafka's stuff, especially The Castle and The Trial. These texts become the leading texts for the existentialists. Fascinating thing. Excellent. Okay, so Ivan's talks. Ivan one day tells Alyosha about this collection of articles that he has kept, newspaper articles, articles from historical works of history. Basically what he has been interested in is, let's say, atrocities, abominations, actions of such cruelty, such refined cruelty. Now, the 20th century can specialize in these, though any century, I'm sure these things, I sometimes think, if one could count things like this, probably they would be equally distributed in every century. And what, after all, is a century? An arbitrary human measurement. We say some century begins this day and ends this day, just like we say the weekend begins this day and ends this day. Meaningless in nature, of course. All these are human attempts to rationalize and organize experience. But anyway, Ivan has a collection, and Dostoevsky clearly collected these things too. This recent movie in Korea that's so popular, Memory of Murder, that everyone is talking about, and of course, that murderer, that serial, S-E-R-I-A-L, killer of women, he's a typical person whom one could cite. Any serial killer, and they are all, aren't they? They are so often killers of women. A few of children, mostly women. Serial killer of men? No. Sometime I'd like to talk about that if Dr. Shin will permit it, this profound misogyny that I find everywhere. I guess in myself too. Anyway, Ivan collects these stories. I'll tell one. Russian landowner, a sadist, S-A-D-I-S-T, one day takes the little boy, 6 years old, maybe 7 years old, beautiful boy, beautiful angelic boy, probably a little Zosima even, perfectly possible. And for some reason, the little boy stepped on an apple. The little boy stepped on by accident. Anyway, he arranges his whole estate. That means all the peasants, hundreds of them, who work his vast farm estate. Everyone is gathered. Now, this man loves to hunt. The typical aristocrat did that. So he's got his collection of hunting dogs, who are scary things. Hunting dogs are scary things. And he puts the little boy out there in the field, within sight of everyone, and suddenly he releases the dogs. The dogs attack and tear the little boy apart. This Russian aristocrat enjoys this spectacle, enjoys not only the spectacle of the little boy being torn apart, but the spectacle of the people, all of whom love that little boy, their horror, their pain, loves it. Well, I mean, how different is he from this serial killer in the Korean movie, Memory of Murder? Not different at all. And there are a lot of them. Okay, so Ivan collects stories of this kind. And of course, partly he tells Alyosha this to horrify Alyosha, because really, for him, Ivan is basically in despair. Ivan is in despair, D-E-S-P-A-I-R. Despair about life, and I think what he does is turn his despair on the God question, the theistic question. And for him it would be a kind of victory to horrify Alyosha so much that Alyosha lost his faith too. That's what's going on. And that's what Dostoevsky makes pretty clear. And Alyosha and Ivan, after telling some of these stories, maybe only one or two, but he has hundreds of them, he says, Ivan says, he will accept God, the existence of God, but he will not accept God's world. He is, quote, giving back his ticket, which is kind of a cryptic, hidden way of saying he plans to commit suicide. Well, this grandiose, bombastic gesture of doesn't accept God's world. When I was young, boy, what a guy. He was my hero. Ivan, the ultimate intellectual. But really, no. Dostoevsky makes it perfectly clear that one can't accept God and, quote, give back one's ticket. One can commit suicide, of course. But what one is doing really is setting one's own personal pride, and in Ivan it's a case of intellectual pride, fueled by this kind of despair that he feels, that he can't master, above any question of God or faith or anything. Ivan, too, can't... If we put Ivan in a room with Zosima, I wonder, that would be interesting. Because the will not to believe is much stronger than the will to believe. The will to despair is much stronger than any will to joy or faith. And even a Zosima cannot overcome the will to despair that's in Ivan, cannot overcome his intellectual pride. And I'll show you exactly what I mean, because that's what Dostoevsky basically says. In the most famous chapter of the book, it's called The Grand Inquisitor. Ivan says that he has written a poem. It's not in poetic form, it's a story, but it's kind of poetic. And he tells Alyosha his poem, The Grand Inquisitor. Okay. Christ has returned in his poem, in the poem, Ivan's poem. Christ has returned to, I think, Toledo in Spain at the height of the Spanish Inquisition. Let's say the mid to late 16th century. The Grand Inquisitor, a powerful man, in Spain his power was probably greater than the Pope's itself. And in many ways greater than the king of Spain's. And Spaniard kings had absolute power too. Christ has mysteriously returned. He is seen in the streets. People recognize him and flock to him, bow to him, weep in paroxysms, violent emotions of religious joy and religious faith. The Grand Inquisitor comes along with some of his henchmen, his muscle, some of them priests, some of them soldiers, shouts briefly a little command. The people disperse immediately, scatter. But what happened to their love and adoration of Christ? And surely This is Christ. The statement Ivan's making is clear, and maybe he's right. Maybe that's exactly what would happen, because they fear that Grand Inquisitor, and their fear of him is much greater than their love of the immediate Christ, or their faith in that Christ. Scary, but plausible. He orders that Christ be arrested and put into a cell, a prison, let's say, and of course Christ does not resist at all, into the cell. Late in the night, maybe, the Grand Inquisitor comes to visit Christ, and in a fascinating monologue, he explains to Christ what's what. And of course the view is quite cynical. What he's saying is the church provides something that men need. Ritual, liturgy, rules, moral rules. Men need these to live, and men need these. Men's need for these things is much deeper than some purely religious need for love and joy, or even closeness, communion with God. And when men can have to choose between faith and those things, along with bread, men will choose those things, ritual, rules, order, over that faith every time. So at the end of this speech by the Grand Inquisitor, Grand Inquisitor says, "You may go now." He knows perfectly well Christ doesn't need his permission to go, and of course Christ, the Son of God, omnipotent and all that, in the popular idea anyway, Christ could immediately strike him dead or something, but this Christ at least, doesn't do such things. And after all, if we look at things seriously at all, if God is active in the world, if God has a plan for history, if God oversees history, then of course God tolerates and uses people like the Grand Inquisitor and people like that landowner who did the terrible thing to the boy, or people like the serial killer of the Korean movie, Memory of a Murder. God is active everywhere. Does God need man to fulfill God's plan, if God has a plan? No. There is some limitation to God's plan, to God's will. I think most people would say no, if God is active in the world. So, of course, the Grand Inquisitor opens the door of the cell. Christ, I hope I'm not wrong here, Christ simply smiles and kisses the Grand Inquisitor and disappears. Now, what's the meaning of that? Ivan ends his story, because remember, this whole story has been Ivan's story, his poem, telling Alyosha. And then Ivan continues about, in such a way that shows how deep his own suffering is. But his own suffering is basically his own intellectual pride. And such intellectual pride is suffering, and has produced his despair, or the despair produces it. These two are inseparable. And so Ivan announces basically that he plans to kill himself. He's obviously in pain. Everything he is told about, the stories he told about the landowner, the killing of the little boy, all the other things, show that Ivan is a tormented soul. Alyosha, of course, sees this, because Alyosha is a childish Zosima. And Alyosha simply stands up, smiles, and kisses Ivan. It's an amazing moment. Now, I'm not sure that Christ kissed the Grand Inquisitor. If he did, whether he did or not, basically he did. Because Alyosha is a Christ figure. And so the Grand Inquisitor is to Christ as Alyosha, no, excuse me, as Ivan is to Alyosha. The two are parallel there. So Alyosha is trying to say no human could, God himself couldn't possibly argue you, Ivan, out of your beliefs, out of your pride, because you cherish it so much, so deeply. It is your God. But accept God's blessing. Know that what Alyosha is saying, he doesn't even know he's saying it. Alyosha doesn't even know what he's saying. But what he's saying is, God loves you too, Ivan. If you could just accept God's love, you could know joy and happiness. But, of course, Ivan can't. Can't means won't. Ivan won't accept God's love. Okay. So, that's arguably the climax, intellectually the climax of this novel. Okay, what happens? The main action. Feodor, the nasty old man, one evening, drunk, always drunk, semi-drunk anyway, is expecting Grushenka to visit him. That's interesting because it makes one think that she has visited him before. Wow, what a thought. But he's very nervous. He's pacing the floor. Smerdyakov, the epileptic, illegitimate son, servant there, is attending him. Fyodor loves Smerdyakov. If he loves anyone, he loves Smerdyakov. But he laughs at Smerdyakov and is amused by him too, I think. Anyway, that night he's waiting for Grushenka. Dimitri, insanely jealous, comes to his father's house because he wants, if Grushenka is there, he will certainly kill his father. He will also kill his father and maybe take his father's money, which he believes is rightfully his. Okay, so the stage is set. Smerdyakov has an epileptic seizure, a fit, and Marfia, his old mother who raised him, takes care of him. But okay, Dimitri comes to the window. First Dimitri meets Grigory, the old servant, and hits him with a piece of metal, a pestle, like a mortar and pestle for crushing foods and things. Hits him with this iron in the head, a lot of blood, badly wounded, and down goes Grigory. It looks like Grigory is dead. Oh, he hits him because he thinks he's his father. That's it. But he's not. So Grigory is unconscious. Marfia is taking care of Smerdyakov, but she is exhausted and she will fall asleep. Fyodor is pacing alone inside the house. The next, that night, Dimitri leaves then after hitting Grigory. Now he's in despair because he thinks he has killed this kind old servant, Grigory. He goes to find Grushenka, and he learns that Grushenka has run away to meet an old lover because she wants to get out of this insane situation of father and son. She's miles away. Dimitri borrows a wagon, steals it probably, the all-night ride through the Russian winter countryside, arrives at an inn in the middle of nowhere. Grushenka is there with her former lover who is a Polish, and disgusting man himself. Dimitri passionately declares his love to Grushenka. She loves him too. And they spend the night in another orgy. Where did this money come from? In the morning, the police arrive and arrest Dimitri for the murder of Feodore, the father. What? No. I struck Dimitri, I struck Grigory, the servant, but I don't know what you're talking about. Well, where did the money for this orgy come from? A lot of money. Well, the truth is, in that earlier orgy, I did not spend all 3,000 of the money that I had from Catherine, only 1,500, saving 1,500 in case Grushenka agreed to run away with me. No one believes that, because many people had heard him say that he had spent all 3,000 that previous night. He's under arrest. He will be tried for murder, the murder of his father and the theft of the money. Then comes the trial. National interest in this trial. Reporters from Moscow, the usual media event, long before there are these other media. Interesting arguments. The prosecutor proves or tries to prove that Dimitri, yes, killed his father. And there's lots of circumstantial evidence in favor of that conclusion. The defense attorney is a clever man, and he tries to prove that psychologically this is impossible. Complex arguments that show very convincingly that Dimitri was not such a man. He didn't have it in him to murder his own father. He's basically a good man, and considers himself a son of God. Okay. Then Ivan and Catherine have been at work. Remember, Catherine is engaged to Dimitri. Ivan, who loves Catherine, nevertheless will help Dimitri, whom he kind of loathes, his brother, his older brother, help Dimitri escape to America. That's where people went. Start a new life. Very possible. So Ivan will give up everything to help Dimitri escape, apparently with Catherine, whom, however, Dimitri doesn't love because he loves Grushenka. Everybody kind of loves somebody else in this, believable enough. Okay, so the trial. But meanwhile, Ivan has been having conversations with his half-brother Smerdyakov. And it turns out that Smerdyakov's hero is Ivan. He wants to be an intellectual too, and he admires Ivan so much. And it turns out, getting to the bottom of this, the murderer of father, Smerdyakov. Because Smerdyakov